Afternoon, friends. Starting the month with the series of webinars where different fields of law and other fields have been touched during all these testing times. In that endeavor, we requested Mr. K. Harishankar, an advocate from the Madras High Court, who is a partner in HSEB, a famous law firm, and he has pursued his law from Madras at Dr. Ambedkar Law College, and then he went to do his master's from Chicago. And he has also worked in Gardner, Carton, and Douglas before returning to India. And thereafter, because of his intensive and extensive work, he has created his niche in various spectrums of law: commercial, arbitration, intellectual properties, and invariably one will find that whenever there is a copyright matter in Madras, he is representing one of the parties. Though copyright is one of his forte, but we felt that the summary suits during these testing times is an issue which invariably keeps on propping up in the mind of a lawyer as well as client. What is the best way for the recovery? And to have what is the juxtaposed position between the CPC and Commercial Court Acts, because Commercial Courts Act after the 2015 has also developed in a big way. What are the ways, procedures, etc., and what is the way to move forward? I would request Mr. Harishankar to give the insights as we had requested to him, and he had kindly consented to share his knowledge on this platform, which the participants who have been connected with us know it, that we go live on the Facebook as well as on this platform, and thereafter we upload it on the YouTube of our channel of Beyond Law CLC. Over to you, Mr. Harishankar, and welcome on the platform on a first day of the month.
Thank you, Vikas. I'm really honored to be invited by you for presenting this talk today. As you said, I do appear a lot in commercial disputes, especially in intellectual property sphere. But summary suits is something that we keep appearing even in the commercial courts day in and day out, and especially at this time due to this pandemic, when most of the other remedies, the summary remedies, there is either a moratorium or some sort of moratorium has been placed in filing of other summary procedures. I think the age-old practice of CPC is still going to be relevant, and in that context, the Commercial Courts Act has also brought in certain changes for summary proceedings, and there are certain new summary proceedings avenues that are open to lawyers. So let me start with, I'll first like to say that I'm not going to dwell too much on the case law or authorities on the point, because summary suits itself, the summary procedure itself, Order 37 under CPC has been dealt with by various high courts and the Supreme Court, and the broad principles is what I will be discussing here. So firstly, I would like to start off by saying that Order 37 of the Civil Procedure Code provides the summary procedure to try a certain class of suits. Now, what are these class of suits and how it is to be done is the procedure. Many a times the Supreme Court has have themselves reiterated that the summary procedure under Order 37 of the Civil Procedure Code is itself a self-contained code, and therefore insofar as Order 37 is concerned, you don't need to look at any other place other than the provisions of Order 37 itself. The object of providing such a summary procedure is mainly to prevent an unreasonable obstruction by a defendant who has no defense. So that is the main object of enacting Order 37 under the Civil Procedure Code. The defendant is normally not entitled to defend a summary suit as a matter of right, but can defend it only if triable issues are made out. Now, with that introduction to Order 37, I will first just read the Rule 1 of Order 37 and then go on to add my comments on the specific points there. Order 37, Rule 1, I read, this order shall apply to the following courts, namely high courts, city civil courts, and courts of small causes, and other courts, provided that in respect of the courts referred to in Clause B, the High Court may, by notification in the Official Gazette, restrict the operation of this order only to such categories of suits as it deems proper, and may also from time to time, as the circumstances of the case may require, by subsequent notification in the Official Gazette, further restrict, enlarge, or vary the categories of suits to be brought under the operation of this order as it deems proper. Now, this Rule 1 and Sub-Rule 1 of Rule 1 mainly deals with what courts can entertain suits under the summary procedure. So as I said, as I read out earlier, this applies to the high courts, city civil courts, and small causes courts. And apart from these three courts which are named in the code itself, there are other courts also to which this procedure, this order can be made applicable to by each high court, which will then have to introduce an amendment to that effect, a rule to that effect. Now, Sub-Rule 2 gives the class of suits which can be filed as summary suits. Not all suits can be filed as summary suits. So, Sub-Rule 2, I quote, subject to the provisions of Sub-Rule 1, the order applies to the following classes of suits, namely, suits upon bills of exchange, hundis, and promissory notes. B, suits in which the plaintiff seeks only to recover a debt or liquidated demand in money payable by the defendant with or without interest arising on a written contract or on an enactment where the sum sought to be recovered is a fixed sum of money or in the nature of a debt other than a penalty, or on a guarantee. And here the Sub-Rule 4 of 2 has been recently added in 2011, stating that a suit for recovery of receivables instituted by any assignee of a receivable. Therefore, many books also you will find that this amendment which came into effect on 1st February 2012 has not been recorded. That is Sub-Rule 4, where assigned debts can also be recovered by filing a summary suit. So this is very well covered, this elaborate rule, Sub-Rule 2, which says that the classes of suits that are covered under the summary procedure, firstly are suits on bills of exchanges, hundis, or promissory notes. Basically, all suits under negotiable instruments, covered by negotiable instruments, can be filed. And secondly, suits for recovery of debts or liquidated demand in money, which is payable by the defendant out of a written contract. Now, this leads us to the question of what is a debt. This, if you cull out from various decisions of the Supreme Court and the various high courts, the essential requirements that are necessary for to constitute a debt are an ascertainable or readily calculable amount, an absolute, unqualified, and present liability in regard to that amount, with the obligation to pay forthwith or in future with a certain time, within a certain time, and that obligation must have accrued and must be subsisting and should not be that which was accruing. Therefore, the debt should be an amount which can be calculated readily. It is a liquidated sum of money and which is owed in present. That is, on the date on which the cause of action has arisen for the plaintiff to sue, that amount must be payable. It should not be something that is going to accrue in future. The next important aspect in sub-rule 2 of rule 1 is that the class of suits is restricted by such of those which are covered by a written contract. So that we need to understand what the meaning of a written contract is. Now, a written contract, normally what we would envisage is something where signatures of both parties are appended and have been exchanged between the parties. Such of those are what we would normally term as written contracts. But insofar as the summary procedure under Order 37 is concerned, the courts have gone beyond contracts which are signed by both parties alone. Therefore, documents that are accepted and exchanged between the parties are sufficient to create a written contract, and appending signatures of parties is not necessary in such cases. For example, I may state that if there is a rent that is payable by a tenant to a landlord under a written rental agreement, those rents which have fallen due can be recovered under the summary procedure by filing a suit under Order 37, or even goods delivered to parties, goods sold and delivered, if it is covered by an invoice or a bill which has been exchanged between the parties, then that would itself form the basis as a written contract, and you can sue, a plaintiff can sue on that invoice or bill for the price of the goods delivered. The next rule, Order 37 Rule 2, relates to the institution of summary suits. Now, this entire procedure has been laid down in the CPC. It's a summary procedure that is provided, and therefore there are certain rules to be followed, and these procedures I would say are more in the nature of mandatory procedures that have to be followed by a plaintiff, and later on there are also procedures on how a defendant can defend these suits. Therefore, these procedural rules have great importance insofar as summary suits are concerned. Institution of summary suits is what Rule 2 of Order 37 deals with. I quote, "A suit to which this order applies may, if the plaintiff desires to proceed hereunder, be instituted by presenting a plaint which shall contain a specific averment to the effect that the suit is filed under this order, b, that no relief which does not fall within the ambit of this rule has been claimed in the plaint, and c, the following inscription immediately below the number of the suit in the title of the suit, namely under Order 37 of the Code of Civil Procedure 1908. Sub-Rule 2, the summons of the suit shall be in form number 4, in Appendix B, or in such other form as may from time to time be prescribed. The defendant shall not defend the suit referred to in Sub-Rule 1 unless he enters an appearance, and in default of his entering an appearance, the allegations in the plaint shall be deemed to be admitted, and the plaintiff shall be entitled to a decree for any sum not exceeding the sum mentioned in the summons, together with interest at the rate specified, if any, up to the date of the decree, and such sum for costs as may be determined by the High Court from time to time by rules made in that behalf, and such decree may be executed forthwith." So Rule 3 of Sub-Rule 3 of Rule 2 deals with what is called as a leave to defend. The defendant shall not be entitled to defend a suit which is filed as a summary suit unless and until he enters appearance and files an application for leave to defend. Now, Article 118 of the Limitation Act prescribes a period of 10 days for a defendant to apply for leave to defend, and this time limit cannot be extended unless the concerned High Court has made a rule to that effect, permitting extension of time under Section 5 of the Limitation Act. Now, this 10 days is both under Article 118 of the Limitation Act and also under Order 37 Rule 3, which we will see next. You will get the same time limit of 10 days. These 10 days are peremptory. You cannot have an extension of this time by filing an application under Section 5 of the Limitation Act. However, there are some judgments of the Madras High Court which have held that on showing sufficient cause, the court could extend the time. But I should say that these judgments are where the extension of time is permitted are minority, and majority of the judgments are to suggest that these time limits cannot be extended at all. The Rule 3 is where the defendant appears before the court in answer to a summary suit, and Rule 3, the procedure for appearance of the defendant is set out. I quote Rule 3, procedure for appearance of the defendant. In a suit to which this order applies, the plaintiff shall, together with the summons under Rule 2, serve on the defendant a copy of the plaint and annexures thereto, and the defendant may at any time within 10 days of such service, so this is where the 10 days comes in, enter an appearance either in person or by pleader, and in either case he shall file in court an address for service of notices on him. Now I'll pause here for a moment before going on to Sub-Rule 2. The 10 days which I was talking about while referring to Rule 2 comes from Rule 3, Sub-Rule 1. And if this 10 days, within 10 days, a defendant does not seek leave of the court to defend the suit, a judgment has to be pronounced by the court. Then Sub-Rule 2 of Rule 3, unless otherwise ordered, all summons, notices, and other judicial process required to be served on the defendant shall be deemed to have been duly served on him if they are left at the address given by him for such service. So this is a normal rule that is applicable even to regular suits, that the address for service that is given by the defendant, any service on the address for service shall be deemed complete. Sub-Rule 3, on the day of entering the appearance, notice of such appearance shall be given by the defendant to the plaintiff's pleader, or if the plaintiff sues in person, to the plaintiff himself, either by notice delivered at or sent by a prepaid letter directed to the address of the plaintiff's pleader or of the plaintiff, as the case may be. Then Sub-Rule 4 of Rule 3, if the defendant enters an appearance, the plaintiff shall thereafter serve on the defendant a summons for judgment in form number 4A, in Appendix B, or such other forms as may be prescribed from time to time, returnable not less than 10 days from the date of service, supported by an affidavit verifying the cause of action and the amount claimed, and stating that in his belief there is no defense to the suit. Sub-Rule 5, the defendant may at any time within 10 days from the service of summons for judgment, by affidavit or otherwise, disclosing such facts as may be deemed sufficient to entitle him to defend, apply on such summons for leave to defend such suit, and leave to defend may be granted to him unconditionally or upon such terms as may appear to the court or judge to be just, provided that leave to defend shall not be refused unless the court is satisfied that the facts disclosed by the defendant do not indicate that he has a substantial defense to raise, or that the defense intended to be put up by the defendant is frivolous or vexatious, provided further that where a part of the amount claimed by the plaintiff is admitted by the defendant to be due from him, leave to defend the suit shall not be granted unless the amount so admitted to be due is deposited by the defendant in court. Now, before proceeding to the hearing of summons for judgment, I would like to point out a couple of important aspects which we come across every day in filing summary suits. In a summary suit, the suit itself is normally filed with the enclosures and the annexures. Subrule 1 refers to the documents that have to be filed along with the plaint and the annexures. Often the issue has come up in courts that if a plaintiff files a suit and does not deliver the documents filed along with the plaint, would it amount to proper service, and would it kickstart the time limit of 10 days that is stated in the rule? Now, courts have held that the delivery of documents that are filed along with the plaint are not necessary or mandatory, but the annexures filed along with the plaint will have to be delivered to the defendant. And so also, the 10 days time that is given for the defendant starts after the notice of appearance. Therefore, first there is a 10 days time limit after the filing of the suit and the summons is issued to the defendant. The first 10 days the defendant gets for filing a notice of appearance. And then after giving the notice of appearance, there is 10 days time from the time that a summons for judgment has been delivered to a defendant for a defendant to file an application for leave to defend. Now, subrule 6 of rule 3 relates to the summons for judgment. A, if the defendant has not applied for leave to defend, or if such application has been made and is refused, the plaintiff shall be entitled to judgment forthwith. Or B, if the defendant is permitted to defend it as to the whole or any part of the claim, the court or judge may direct him to give such security and within such time as may be fixed by the court or judge, and that on failure to give such security within the time specified by the court or judge, or to carry out such other directions as may have been given by the court or judge, the plaintiff shall be entitled to judgment forthwith. The court or judge may, for sufficient cause shown by the defendant, excuse the delay of the defendant in entering an appearance or in any applying for leave to defend the suit. Therefore, this subrule 7 gives the power to the court to excuse the delay, but that again has been interpreted differently by different high courts, and eventually what today remains is that on showing sufficient cause, there is a delay that can be excused in the appearance. Based on these three rules, rules 1 to 3 of Order 37, the Supreme Court has evolved the principles or set the principles regarding what are the class of cases which defendants should be entitled to defend. When a triable issue arises, and such triable issue arises, then what should be the course of action to be followed by the courts? The Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, has reiterated the following principles. Number one, if the defendant satisfies the court that he has a good defense to the claim on merits, the defendant is entitled to unconditional leave to defend. Now, this is fairly simple, that where the defendant makes out a triable issue, then he is entitled to an unconditional leave to defend. Secondly, if the defendant raises a triable issue indicating that he has a fair or bona fide or reasonable defense, although not a possible good defense, the defendant is entitled to unconditional leave to defend. So here again, where there is a bona fide defense and which can be amplified by the defendant only in the course of trial, the court, while viewing an application to leave to defend, while hearing an application to leave to defend, should come to the conclusion that this is a bona fide defense, and such a bona fide defense can be elaborated by the defendant only at a trial. Then also the defendant would be entitled to an unconditional leave to defend. Then there are cases where the court feels that a triable issue could be made out only at the stage of trial, but the defendant has to be put on terms. And these are the cases where a conditional leave to defend is granted, and the condition could be to either deposit the amount into the court or any other security to secure the debt of the plaintiff. So broadly, these three are the principles that govern triable issues. And when a defendant makes out a triable issue, either grant an unconditional leave, or if the triable issue is something that is not apparent at the moment, but it is only later at the trial that the defendant can come out with more details of a triable issue, then grant a conditional leave to defend. Order 37, Rule 4, as I said earlier, Order 37 itself is a self-contained code, and therefore what applies to regular suits does not apply to suits filed under the summary procedure of Order 37. Order 37, Rule 4 gives the procedure for setting aside ex parte decrees in a summary suit. Now, having given this specific procedure in Order 37, it goes without saying that the normal procedure for setting aside ex parte decrees under Order 9, Rule 13 does not apply to summary suits filed under Order 37. So after the decree is passed, under special circumstances, the court may at any stage set aside a decree. And while setting aside the decree, again the court can make orders relating to costs and other security that the defendant has to offer before allowing them to set aside the decree and then defend the suit. Therefore, these are the main rules in Order 37 relating to the filing of summary suits. I have stated briefly on what the class of suits are and what is the procedure upon filing the suit, what the plaintiff has to follow, and what a defendant needs to follow for defending such suits, and also for setting aside of ex parte decrees in such suits. Rules 5 to 7 deal with aspects such as what should go into a decree in a summary suit, and those are pretty easily understandable provisions relating to costs and other procedures in summary suits. Now, having discussed summary suits, the Commercial Courts Act in 2015 did not make any amendments to the CPC insofar as Order 37 is concerned, and therefore the summary suits as is are available for commercial courts also, and therefore commercial disputes can also be tried summarily. But there was a very important departure that the legislature has made while enacting the Commercial Courts Act, and a separate class of suits where summary judgment can be obtained by a plaintiff or a defendant in that matter, has been laid down in, and a special amendment has been brought to the CPC under Order 13A. 13 capital A has been introduced to CPC by virtue of the Commercial Courts Act, and amendments have been brought in. Order 13A deals with cases where both parties, either a plaintiff or a defendant, can be entitled to a summary judgment. It is summary due to the fact that this procedure can be availed of even prior to trial or prior to evidence being recorded in these class of suits. Order 13A, as amended by the Commercial Courts Act, I will quote, "This order sets out the procedure by which courts may decide a claim pertaining to any commercial dispute without recording oral evidence." So therefore, the object is very clear that this is an additional class of suits other than those stated in Order 37, where a claim can be decided by a court. What is very important that we must note here is that the word that is used in 13A is a claim, and it does not talk about either a plaintiff or a defendant. Therefore, this summary judgment procedure under the Commercial Courts Act, or as per the amendments introduced by the Commercial Courts Act, is available both to plaintiffs and defendants. Now that will be clear when we read the further provisions of Order 13A. For the purpose of this order, the word claim shall include part of a claim, any particular question on which the claim, whether in whole or in part, depends, or a counterclaim as the case may be. Therefore, even a counterclaim can give rise to a claim which can be decided summarily by a commercial court or the commercial division of the High Court. Notwithstanding anything to the contrary, an application for summary judgment under this order shall not be made in a suit in respect of any commercial dispute that is originally filed as a summary suit under Order 37. So the legislature has made it very clear that the procedure for summary judgment is in addition to Order 37 of the Civil Procedure Code, and those class of cases which fall under Order 37 and which have been filed as summary suits cannot be filing an application for a summary judgment. Therefore, Sub-Rule 3 of Rule 1 of Order 13A makes that very clear. The stage at which an application for summary judgment can be filed in a commercial dispute is an applicant may apply for summary judgment at any time after summons has been served on the defendant, provided that no application for summary judgment may be made by such applicant after the court has framed the issues in respect of the suit. Therefore, in a commercial dispute, a summary judgment application can be filed by either party at any time prior to framing of the issues. The grounds on which a summary judgment can be sought for from a commercial court or commercial division of the High Court are elaborated in Sub-Rule 3. The court may give a summary judgment against a plaintiff or defendant on a claim if it considers that the plaintiff has no real prospect of succeeding on the claim, or the defendant has no real prospect of successfully defending the claim, as the case may be, and there is no other compelling reason why the claim should not be disposed of before recording of oral evidence. Therefore, in this additional class of summary suits that has been created by the Commercial Courts Act, the court has to come to a conclusion that there is nothing worthwhile that is going to happen by allowing the parties to go to record evidence in this matter. And in such a case, the court can say that it may be made on an admission. Basically, this is a judgment on admission, or where it is covered by contracts and written documents that the parties need not go to trial to prove those documents. If the court is of such an opinion, then in such cases, the claims can be decided and parties can avail of the summary judgment procedure available under the Commercial Codes Act. The procedure for summary judgment, for filing an application under summary judgment, is elaborated in Rule 4 of Order 13A of CPC. An application for summary judgment to a court shall, in addition to any other matters the applicant may deem relevant, include the matters set forth in subclauses A to F mentioned hereunder. The application must contain a statement that it is an application for summary judgment made under this order. B, the application must precisely disclose all material facts and identify the point of law, if any. C, in the event the applicant seeks to rely upon any documentary evidence, the applicant must include such documentary evidence in its application and identify the relevant content of such documentary evidence on which the applicant relies. Therefore, at the time of filing the application, as we saw in Rule 2 of Order 37, here also there are certain mandatory things that an applicant has to follow while filing an application for summary judgment. And that being that the point of law and the issues involved will have to be elaborated. And if there is any documentary evidence that is going to be relied on, that document must also be marked at this point in time along with the application. The application must state the reason why there are no real prospects of succeeding on the claim or defending the claim, as the case may be. The application must state what relief the applicant is seeking and briefly state the grounds for seeking such relief. Where a hearing for summary judgment is fixed, the respondent must be given at least 30 days notice of the date fixed for hearing and the claim that is proposed to be decided. Now, therefore, further going down in Order 13A, the procedure that the period of notice, that there has to be a 30 days notice, but these are all mainly guidelines for the court to follow, because in a commercial court or the commercial division, the court sets time limits, and these time limits have been prescribed in the code itself as amended. Therefore, 30 days time is given to the parties, to the respondent in an application to prepare for an application, to answer an application for summary judgment. And a reply must also be filed in writing, and the evidence for hearing of summary judgment, since there is no documentary evidence or oral evidence that is going to be recorded, the documents relied on will also have to be filed, and under Rule 5, the evidence for hearing of a summary judgment has been prescribed under the Act. Now, the further rules under Order 13A only elaborate on these procedural aspects that will guide the court in deciding an application for summary judgment. So that brings me to the end of this presentation on the summary procedure under the Civil Procedure Code and the summary judgment as amended by the Commercial Codes Act. So what we have seen is that Order 37 is itself a self-contained code. It has an elaborate procedure on how and what class of suits such summary procedure can be applied. And invariably, as practitioners, what we lose sight of is the class of suits where the summary procedure under Civil Procedure Code can be availed of. It is not necessary that there has to be either an admission of liability or even any other written contract signed by both parties. Even a contract that is formed by exchange of correspondence can form the basis for a summary suit under Order 37 of the Code. And in addition to Order 37, for commercial disputes, those that are defined under Section 21C of the Commercial Codes Act, for such commercial disputes, there is an additional avenue which is available due to the introduction of amendment to Order 13A of the Code of Civil Procedure. And Order 13A summary judgment is not only applicable to plaintiffs, but both sides, the plaintiff and the defendant, can file applications for deciding any claim made by either of them in a suit to be decided and a summary judgment pronounced thereupon. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, friends. And I'd be happy if you have any questions or anything to be addressed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. The way it was summarized, it actually told the topic that it's a summary suit. Because summary suit also gives the pith and substance, what actually one wants. And the same way, if the topic gives what actually one wants in a snapshot, that's the way. This is by Dr. M. Srinivas. What is the subtle difference between a commercial court and a debts recovery tribunal?
So it's a very good question, because I was in fact going to address on that, saying that prior to the Recovery of Debts Due to Banks and Financial Institutions Act and the constitution of DRTs, most of the bank suits used to be filed as only summary suits. And in fact, courts have repeatedly recognized that insofar as bankers are concerned, even the books of accounts and statements maintained by bankers can form the basis for summary suits. But after the advent of the debts recovery tribunals, banks have a faster summary procedure available under the RDDB Act. And therefore, this procedure, summary suits under the CPC, is not being used. But for that, there is not much of a difference between the procedure prescribed under the RDDB Act and what was earlier done under the Civil Procedure Code.
But he is asking, how does commercial court differ? Because in the commercial court, it's not necessary to be a scheduled bank.
Correct. Commercial court is available to every commercial dispute, not just banks. And of course, by virtue of the provisions of the RDDB Act, the commercial courts would not entertain suits for recovery filed by banks, because they have a separate forum and jurisdiction has been vested in the debts recovery tribunals for that. Therefore, the commercial court cannot exercise jurisdiction under the RDDB Act. It is under the regular civil courts, where the commercial courts have been constituted for the purpose of commercial disputes.
According to you, it would be on the principles of that the special act will prevail over the general act?
Absolutely.
This is by Sameer S. Shah. Why that a condonation application in filing the leave to appeal is not maintainable? Are there judgments both sides, or this one way?
There are judgments both ways on the applicability of the Limitation Act. However, the Bombay High Court seems to have brought in an amendment making Section 5 applicable to leave to defend applications. Insofar as the Madras High Court is concerned, there is no such direct rule that has been brought in by the High Court. However, there are cases where the court has exercised jurisdiction under Section 5, and there are division bench judgments on that point as well.
This is by Ramakrishnan. I suppose he was in your office only. B. Ramakrishnan. When the leave to appeal is accepted unconditionally, what is the recourse available to the plaintiff?
Leave is granted unconditionally. I think the only recourse is to file a revision or an appeal challenging that decision of the court. And otherwise, there cannot be any recourse to an unconditional leave. But most cases of late, even the Supreme Court has been reiterating that unconditional leave should not be granted, and plaintiffs, the defendants, will have to be put on terms.
This is under the rent. This is by Anurag Jain. Under the rent law, tenant always denies his liability to pay payment of rent on the ground that the same stands paid. Even then, can the proceedings be initiated under Order 37?
Yeah, so what happens in the rent acts is that the rent control tribunals take over the jurisdiction for determining whether or not there is a default. And after the determination is done is when the civil court's role comes in, when the amount has to be recovered. So the answer to that question would be that if the rent tribunal decides that there is no default in payment of rent and therefore there is no liability, there is no debt, then you cannot maintain an action for under a summary procedure in any civil court for recovery of the amount. But without that, when there is no determination by the rent tribunals, you can still go ahead and file a summary suit itself to say that a liability has arisen based on the agreement and with proof or evidence of non-payment of the rents. The plaintiff would be entitled to a maintain a summary suit. You're on mute. I think Vikas is on mute. I'll just take the next question from the chat box. What is the timeline for disposal of a summary suit? Now, as I said, Rule 2 and Rule 3 gives various timelines for disposal of or for various acts to be done by the parties, and that decides the timeline in which a summary suit is to be disposed of. So initially, there is a 10 days time within which a notice of appearance has to be given by the defendant. And upon the notice of appearance being given, the defendant will have to be served with a summons for judgment. And once the summons for judgment is served on the defendant, he has 10 days time to file an application for leave to defend. And thereafter, the time is determined by the court while hearing the application for leave to defend. Therefore, there is no outer limit like some of the enactments like the Consumer Protection Act and other proceedings have. There is no outer limit within which the proceedings will have to be completed. After the stage of summons for judgment, it is the leave to defend application. It is the court that determines the time. The next.
I can read that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is issue of demand notice compulsory before the institution of a suit? This is by Ravi Ritesh, sir.
No, there is no necessity to issue a demand. It's not mandatory. However, in many cases, the non-issue of demand notice prior to suit may be of importance at the stage of deciding of an application to leave to defend. Therefore, when the defendant applies for leave, he will certainly make an issue about the non-issue of a demand notice, and that tends to weigh in the mind of the court while deciding an application for leave to defend.
This is by Darjing GD. What is the timeline for the disposal of a summary suit?
That I answered earlier. There is no specific time limit for disposal of the suit itself, but it is only insofar as the service of summons and the notice of appearance and the filing of leave to defend application. For all of these, time limits are prescribed in the Act. After that stage of leave to defend, it is the court that determines the time.
This is by Payal Bharat Kotwani. If leave to defend filed by the defendant builder in a summary suit filed in 2016 is filed after 3 years and the defendant has denied the issuance of the allotment letter to the plaintiff, for which refund of consideration is claimed, is trial and recording of evidence necessary in such a case?
Normally, in such cases, if leave to defend is not filed, then the court has to go ahead and pronounce judgment on the basis of whatever evidence is available and what has been let in by the plaintiff, filed by the plaintiff along with the suit.
This is by Samisha. If the rent tribunal has not accepted the case of a tenant and in a summary suit, the same defense can be taken or not?
It doesn't constitute a triable issue, would be my view of the matter, that once a rent court has not accepted the tenant's plea of the rent not being due, then that cannot be the basis for a leave to defend application by the defendant in a summary suit.
This is by Advocate KP Boda. Is it necessary to file affidavit of service of first notice or not?
The procedure itself prescribes that upon service of the summons, there has to be an affidavit that is given in the prescribed form. Rules 2 and 3, Rule 2 deals with those forms, and it is part of the code itself as to how the service has to be proved before the court in a summary suit.
This is by Raj. In a summary suit, the client got the summons via post, defendant turned up, but the plaintiff did not turn up for hearings. It's 1 year now, and the plaintiff did not turn up for 2 more hearings. Can the defendant file in leave to appeal after 1 year?
Leave to defend after 1 year may not be available, but if the plaintiff does not follow the procedure under the summary suit, under the summary procedure, then the suit will have to be converted as a regular suit, and then the regular whatever applies to regular suits will apply, and the defendant is entitled to defend, and even thereafter if the plaintiff doesn't appear, the suit will have to be dismissed for default.
In a DRT, the successful bidder, even on payment of total bid amount, is not registered, is not being registered the property stating there was an application of defaulter to pay the bank total default amount within 10 days from auction, but did not pay after 90 days. What is the recourse for the successful bidder?
I would assume that this is under the RDTB Act itself. There is a procedure prescribed
yes.
when the buyer, the purchaser in an auction does not pay the price or deposit the amount. So therefore that procedure will prevail, and it would not give rise to a summary suit.
That's provided under Order 21 Rule 80 or something around, because
Yes.
89 and 90 deals with the refund of the money. I think it should be in and around that place only. If the defendant is not taking the notices willfully, what is the recourse?
See, the Rule 3 itself is very clear that once the notice is left, the summons for judgment is left at the known address of the defendant, then it is deemed to be served. Therefore, nothing further need be done, and the court has to proceed to pronounce a decree as though there is no application for leave to defend.
I think that will also come into being. What is the procedure of WhatsApp and email while doing? Now it's very difficult for somebody to avoid the summons once those have been accepted modes of service.
Yes, courts have accepted WhatsApp and electronic,
The
electronic
modes, etc., for the purposes of
a blue tick is sufficient now.
No, nowadays even blue tick sometimes avoided. You can always check
you
it.
Can avoid it. You can avoid it.
No, you can check it and tick it, and you can have the impression of a red also. The blue tick is not important. So that becomes another facet. So I will just check it on, because on the platform we are not having any questions. I will just check on as to whether we are having on the Facebook. This is, can negotiable instrument tax proceedings be also tried as a summary trial or not?
Yes, of course. The initial purpose for which the summary procedure was introduced was covering the negotiable instruments, and therefore that can be done. But whether it will apply to 138 cases expressly to be done as a summary procedure, that is a separate procedure that has been devised specifically for negotiable instruments under the section 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. So that will not be covered. But yes, on unpaid checks, instead of filing 138 action, you could also file a summary suit.
Can it be filed on both the platforms, or do we have does the doctrine of election prevail?
You can file it in both places, because your 138 Negotiable Instruments Act action is not for recovery, but it is for the offense. That is the criminal action and the civil action. Both can go on simultaneously.
Samisha is commenting upon you that you are as cool as a cucumber, just like what you are in the court.
Long time since we have met face to face, so good to hear Samir's name.
He says, this is what Seema Joshi has taken forward. What if someone has turned off his red report on WhatsApp?
Yeah, so those are complications that arise now, because technology, as it improves, people are finding new ways to evade notices and summons. So I think that is yet to come up in courts. Courts are yet to express on what happens if there is no blue tick. Or
no, but that's my personal take. Once you read on the info, you get that he has read it. Blue tick is not important, but once you get the information that he has read, so I think it should be
as long as there is a means to prove that the person has read it, then I think that should be taken.
Because once you read the blue tick, not even blue tick,
irrespective of whether there is a blue tick or not, you can still do
it. It is just like in a WhatsApp group. You can check the information, who has received it and who has read it.
Yes, of course.
It is now. Similar issues also arise with emails. Can't be sure whether the receiver has read the email or not.
Yeah, so the courts have been going ahead with emails on the basis that if it is shown as a regular email address of the defendant, of the other party, then they accept it.
Okay. So, Mr. Harishankar, we don't have any other questions, but the questions which were put up across, they were all well received. And needless to add that the way you had expressed all the things, that was in a subtle and a simple manner which could be understood by everyone. So I thank, on behalf of all those who have been watching Facebook as well as on this participating in this platform, we are all thankful to you, the way you have expressed all these things. And my words are also being buttressed from the lot of messages being popped up while I'm expressing the vote of thanks on the chat box to state therein that they had a wonderful session. And tomorrow, in pursuing that, since today's webinars and tomorrow are also quite I may not say exactly juxtaposed, but yes, a large number of issues would be there. This is again by the senior advocate from Madras High Court, Mr. N.L. Raja. He would be speaking on Commercial Courts Act, theory, practice, and procedure. That what is the difference between what actually is written in the theory part and how you have to practice and the procedure. So do stay connected with us tomorrow at 5 p.m. Everyone stay safe, stay blessed. And I just saw on the participants, Mr. Srinath was also there. Thank you to the HSCP team. And Mr. Samir is asking for the Zoom ID and password. He can connect us on the WhatsApp group. We automatically float that, and it's also on the Facebook and the Instagram if you follow us. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay blessed, and namaskar to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Vikas. Thank you all. Thank you.
Have a new September month much better than what we have had for around last 6 months. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.